I like the age group of preschoolers because, first of all, they can talk. It's a fascinating period because they're not in school yet. They're not as they just sometimes have very strange ideas, and it is really fun to talk to them and to listen to them and to see what's the foundation of their weird ideas that they have and that seem to so silly to us and so nonsensical. But they have a reason for it. They just think so differently, qualitatively differently than we as adults, and I find that fascinating. And that is for that reason I like to really assess preschool children. And they're also a bit wild still, and not as measured. There are not as many social norms that constrains them, and makes it fascinating to interact with them and assess them. Kids nowadays are more hurried. The hurried child, they're put into some kind of organized activities but don't spend as much unstructured time by themselves outdoors anymore. Therefore there's a decrease of time spent outside, and there are people who think that is leading to something called a nature deficit disorder. That is not a clinical diagnosis, but it is meant to indicate that children can't regulate themselves anymore as well, because nature is important for the development of self-regulation. They don't play as well. A number of other outcomes, negative outcomes, are associated with this. And in response to the decrease of time spent outdoors, I think it was the Zug School District started a nature kindergarten a couple of years ago, 2011. And I was part of it, the whole development of it, safety plan and curriculum, all these aspects. And we were asked to do a research study, assessing the children at the beginning of the school year in the nature kindergarten and at the end of the school year, and also comparing them to children in a regular kindergarten. Therefore, we had children spending from 8:45 to 11:45 outside every day, regardless of weather. I think they weren't outside twice because of wind or so, and but that was it. And we compared those children, two cohorts from the same kindergarten. We compared them to a regular kindergarten children, and the children who had spent a year in the nature kindergarten, they had better motor coordination skills, and also according to the teachers and parents, they did better in terms of their social functioning. Therefore, their social skills had improved over the course of 1 year more than the social skills of children in a regular kindergarten. And I think the one reason of that was that when I went out with them and walked on the tour, where they had one of 3 spots that they visited, one in Old Growth Forest, one on the beach, another in a meadow area with creeks around it, they often engaged in collaborative projects. Like one day they had to look for salamanders, and they had to join forces in order to lift these tree trunks, and that just struck me how much more cooperative, collaborative it is. And I found in 2 studies in Germany for these forest schools, where we found the kids in forest schools and what to eat, and children in regular, the discovery learning. Another aspect was I then walked next to the kids and they said, oh yeah, do you know this type of fern? I didn't know. And then we talked about different types of fern. Therefore they had knowledge of biodiversity that my kids who went to regular kindergarten don't have.
You know what, sometimes if you look in the back,
anything like that at all. And we had also a measure of nature relatedness, because one concern is that
what noise will it make?
That we don't have any impetus to protect this nature. And conserving nature so largely hinges on having nature, feeling essentially the German romantic writer said Novalis, treating nature as a you. Therefore, it's not some abstract entity that you instrumentally can exploit, but rather something that is like a person, like somebody who's just opposite to you and you communicate with.
Yeah.
And
that's beautiful.
Yeah, that is Novalis was right. That was quite prescient. But the argument is that contact with nature, early contact with nature, would foster this kind of nature relatedness that would be a prerequisite for later preserving of nature and care for nature, because care also in children arises in a relationship. And if you have no relationship to nature, why would you care? It's very difficult to build this up abstractly. You can, but it's more complicated.
Well, I think the idea of thinking in terms of systems and relationships, I call it ecosystems thinking, that pervades everything. It relates to everything. And right now, in a Western colonial context, many of us have grown up being taught a very different way of operating. So one of the examples of that from an illustration is the organizational chart of University of Victoria, actually, which as you can see, I got this off their website some time ago. And as you can see, it's laid out with boxes, very discrete boxes separated from each other, each one a category, and in hierarchical arrangements.
Absolutely.
So that you have these layers of authority. Everything is very separate, discrete from everything else. And that's the way that government operates. You have these individual departments, sometimes to the extent that a different department will be dealing with oceans than is dealing with land, even though salmon go on both.
Yeah.
There's this idea of separation and categorization, taxonomy.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely.
And that relates to views of time, where if one is thinking in terms of these separate boxes, the past is far behind us and getting farther every day. And the present is here, the future is somewhere out there. A very different way of organizing the world is shown in this chart, which is off of the Alaska Native Knowledge Network's website. It's a spiral chart for integrated learning. It happens to be suggesting how one might conceive of a curriculum. It reflects a whole way of thinking, which is so different from the boxes we've been looking at. Instead of boxes, we have everything spiraling together with everything else. So here are various themes that this course might think about, everything spiraling together.
Yes.
And instead of a hierarchy, you have everything at any moment relating to all the others, which is how the world actually functions.
Yes.
Ecosystems are always a system. You can't separate each component out into these. Yes. So this is really reflecting the way the world works.
That family.
Absolutely.
Right there.
Absolutely right there. It also encourages a way of relating between generations, which is very different from a society that categorizes people by age. If you look at the school system, you're grouped by how old you are, not by your experiences, your aptitudes, your interests, but how old you are.
Yeah.
And that type of grouping continues on pretty much throughout life. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. Based on that type of categorizing, linear, hierarchical, you hear parents so often talking about how big you are. You know, and the goal of the child is to become older and older and older until you get to be middle-aged, at which point the goal is to stay younger and younger and younger. But but at any rate, the goal is there are value systems along that linear line.
Oh, absolutely.
In a way that a model like this does. And that translates into how families relate to different generations.
Absolutely. And what about stages of child development and life stages?
Yeah, life stages is a very interesting question because stages always require that you have qualitative differences between human beings. And unless there's a qualitative difference, you cannot say, okay, here's a different stage. Otherwise, it would just be incremental increases where you cannot separate one stage from the other because you need some kind of step, some qualitative difference in order to say this is different than the other. I entirely agree that there are qualitative differences in development that I would call stages. The term stages has come into disrepute a little bit in the area of Piaget because people say there are no qualitative differences, kids are little adults already, and I would not say this is quite correct. But stages raises also a very important other issue, because when you talk about stages, in development, you often talk about universal stages. Do they hold across all different cultures? And I am not so sure whether they do. I think in some areas they might, like there are certain very elementary stages of cognitive development where you could say, okay, the child can grasp one object like this, and then the kid can use this object to pull this next. Therefore, you can construct a relation between your hand and one object, and then between your hand, the object, and another object. But these are very abstract kind of relations that you construct, and those complexity of relations, they can increase with development. There may be something universal. But as soon as you put in a particular content, like this toy may be something that a child raised in a Western culture can use in order to do this, but not a child raised in another culture. The cultural dependence, therefore, of stages such as Erikson's stages, with trust, and then Erikson has 8 stages through the life that start with a stage of trust versus mistrust and ends with a stage of despair versus hope. Therefore, old age, either you look back on your life and you think, oh my God, I screwed up all my life and there's nothing I can do about it, and let's just hang it up, and or hope, or you can just look at your life and say, okay, this was not that good, but I learned from it and so on, and it's just the person who I am. Interpretation again, the construction plays an important role. But whether all these stages exist across all different cultures that Erikson, for example, came up with, or others, is for me an open question. When you have a stage of development now, like take Piaget's theory, and you say, okay, the stage of development, the goal of cognitive development is be able to reason scientifically. Well, so should that be the goal of cognitive development? What kind of cultural value do you bring in to say this is the goal to which development has to go towards? Whenever you have a stage, you have an end point.
Yeah.
And the end point reflects the cultural value.
Yes,
And
yes.
this end point, with different cultural values, you can construct different endpoints to which then development converges. And that is something which I think always has to be critically reflected upon when you do developmental psychology. It's a construction. Therefore, I come back. If you apply it to myself, stage theories are constructed. Even Piaget's constructivist theory was constructed.
Yeah.